Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, so the US Foreign Minister, has now said that the Russo-Ukrainian war is a US-Russia proxy war. So what is going on? Why suddenly does Marco Rubio, a very well-experienced politician in terms of US foreign policy, until pretty recently seen as a serious figure, suddenly spewing out statements that could have been written in the Kremlin, actually mirror a lot of the pro-Russian propaganda either coming out of Moscow or being disseminated via their buddies in the West. And what does all this mean on the current trajectory of the Russo-Ukrainian war, or as Marco Rubio would like to have it called, the US-Russia proxy war? So, Привit, my name is Connor Klein, and welcome to Geopolitics with Connor Klein. I'm going to focus on the Russo-Ukrainian war. I have a background in international relations, have lived in Ukraine for many years, and speak the languages of the region. So I'm here to give you a more nuanced and insightful perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war, not the US-Russia proxy war. But anyways, let's start off with what is a proxy war. So when I just Google the word to see what comes up first, it is described as a military conflict in which one or more third parties directly or indirectly support one or more state or non-state combatants in an effort to influence the conflict's outcome and thereby to advance their own strategic interests or to undermine those of their opponents. So once a war basically goes out of having two parties in it in any sort of shape or form, then basically, according to this definition, everything would be a proxy war. It'd actually be pretty hard to have a war that was not a proxy war, because at some point they're going to probably get arms, materiel, maybe manpower, money from a third party, so from another state or a non-state actor. And the reason for those countries to give the money and materiel or to send soldiers is to influence the outcome, and presumably it should be in that country's strategic interest. Now, it could also be not in their strategic interest, which is perhaps going to play in a little bit here with the Russo-Ukrainian war and suddenly the Putin pivot, as I'm calling it since yesterday, with America no longer seeming to be Ukraine's ally in this conflict. Now, the term proxy war has been used a lot by pro-Kremlin narratives in the West to undermine the credibility of Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasions, an attempt to subjugate Ukraine and stop it from being able to join the West, basically leave Russia's sphere of influence, which is what the majority of Ukrainians have wanted to do for quite a while. This is what led to this war. Russia was not able to achieve its political aims, which are to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence by peaceful means or just by underhand, maybe semi-peaceful means. So they've now decided to launch wars against Ukraine in order to achieve that political aim. There is the old adage from Karl von Clausewitz, which is politics is the continuation of, or war is the continuation of politics by other means. So it is seen in a quite derogatory sense to refer to the conflict as a proxy war. And the fact that Marco Rubio now reframed it as a Russia-US proxy war is quite odd on the face of it, and suggests that, well, really, the Europeans, never mind the Ukrainians, are just not relevant to this war. And there is particular evidence as to why it has been framed in that way that I'll go into in a moment or two. So let's look at the actors in the belligerents in this conflict. Basically, you got Ukraine on one side, who are directly engaged with Russia on the other side. Most of the fighting has been taking place in Ukraine since Russia invaded Ukraine, although it doesn't seem like the US government want to refer to it as an invasion or Russian aggression anymore. We'll get into that as well in a minute. And there is a small amount of fighting going on Russia itself, so de jure Russia, that is in the Kursk Oblast. This war began in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea and then parts of the Donbass. Now, there are soldiers from other countries in significant numbers from North Korea fighting on the Russian side. They are supposedly in that area of Russia called Kursk mainly, and that is where they've been fighting. Otherwise, officially, as far as we know, there aren't significant numbers of US or French or Chinese or Iranian troops. They could be trainers or some other small number of security personnel, but nothing significant. However, in terms of financial and military support, there are a lot of different actors from outside of Russia and Ukraine trying to influence the outcome of the war for their own strategic interests. They would be Iran, which has sent their drones, and now Russia has been able to manufacture and copy those drones for internal production. You have North Korea, which, as I said, has sent even a significant number of troops, reportedly 13,000 to assist Russia. On top of that, they've also sent significant materiel to Russia. Obviously, you have China, which is a little bit less involved than Iran and North Korea on the Russian side, however, has been helping the Russians with a large amount of materiel, not the things like tanks or drones, but other material. And most importantly, they have been buying Russian resources and doing business with Russia to keep the war machine going financially. Well, at least that is what it helps Russia to do. Also, you could say India, to a certain extent, has been buying a lot of Russian resources. On the other side, we have Ukraine, and about 30 to 40% of its materiel comes from its European allies or other allies in general, other than the United States, and 30 to 40% comes from the United States at the moment. And a significant amount of financial support comes from mainly from the European Union countries and institutions and the United Kingdom, and then a small part comes from the United States, at least up until the Trump administration took over. So there you have many different parties. So it would be rather odd to say that there are two belligerents. We have Ukraine and Russia, and if it's a proxy war, they would then therefore be proxies. So why is Mark Rubio saying that it's a proxy war between the US and Russia? That would suggest that there's no other, that Russia is not the proxy of anyone. That would seem quite odd in that framework that we're using. Surely they would just be a proxy of China, for example, or Iran, or North Korea. All of these are adversaries of the United States, including Russia. And if you're going to say that just because the US gives military and financial support without sending troops, it would seem that, well, Ukraine would be less of a proxy to the US than Russia is to, say, North Korea, for example. So the definition doesn't really make sense. However, this framing is in conjunction with this huge pivot by Donald Trump's new administration away from supporting Ukraine to a very generous description being neutral. And I would say that they are actually leaning more towards Russia and helping Russia effectively win this war than Ukraine at the present time. Over the last few weeks, we have seen huge insults directed towards Ukraine, Ukrainians, and their leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, by Donald Trump himself and many members of his new administration. Obviously, we had the infamous diplomatic debacle in the Oval Office that took place with Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, on Friday. Obviously, that's been covered in great detail. That was unprecedented to see such a conversation or argument take place in public. It is completely against diplomatic decorum. It was outrageous and scandalous that that would take place. And even more so because, at least up until that point, Ukraine is believed to be an ally of the US. They were there ostensibly to sign a reconstruction agreement, basically an agreement to extract resources and pay for Ukraine's reconstruction with that money going forward, and the US would have a lot of control over how that money was going to be spent, and presumably US companies would have taken part. However, it quickly became quite an unsettling undiplomatic situation. We've had, in the lead up to that, Donald Trump described Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator, say that he would lose the next election, he has no support in the country, which is not credible, that the US gave $350 billion of aid to Ukraine, which is grossly overestimated. Its true figure is probably somewhere between, it mightn't even really in reality be 100 billion if you say that the money that the US gave to Ukraine, i.e. they spent in their own factories making new munitions for themselves so that then they could send the old stock that was about to go obsolete to Ukraine. If we say that isn't actually aid to Ukraine, just the real value of the obsolete stuff, then it's probably not even 100 billion. And he blamed Ukraine for starting the war. Absolutely ridiculous, counterfactual or anti-factual, unfactual statements. Then we have Marco Rubio suddenly framing the war in the sense of a Kremlin narrative that it is just the US and Russia who should be at the table. Basically, that not just Ukraine should be excluded, also the Europeans should be excluded. But the Europeans apparently are going to have to be the ones to send their troops to enforce any sort of ceasefire or peace deal, but they're not allowed to be at the table. It is absolutely a farcical situation if you think that the United States is actually mediating something here. They are simply trying to decide the future of Ukraine and of Europe, in effect, with the aggressor, with Russia. Russia that continues to send rockets and drones and kill not just Ukrainian soldiers, but civilians, and destroy civilian infrastructure on an almost daily basis, while Donald Trump and his administration are berating Vladimir Zelensky for not wanting peace. It is an absolutely ridiculous situation and very disingenuous. Now, it's not just Marco Rubio who's starting to sound like this, or is sounding like this. We had the retired General Keith Kellogg, who a lot of pro-Ukrainians had some sort of remarkable faith in just a couple of months ago, which I personally never shared because I never saw any evidence to believe that he was going to be an honest broker between the two sides. He had the audacity to blame the Ukrainians yesterday for the fact that the US has now cut off not just the financial support that was through USAID primarily, and that was, of course, basically disbanded. Now there's a Supreme Court case that found against that, but we have to see what happens. They've cut off the military aid that has been paused or suspended. Again, legally dubious whether actually the executive branch of the US government can do that on their own, since that is money that has been mandated by the legislator, Congress, to be spent. And they are no longer sharing intelligence with Ukraine, and a private company, Mazar, that sells commercial, footage, satellite footage. They are now, apparently, as of this morning, no longer supplying Ukraine with that vital information. So they're basically trying overall to create an environment where Ukraine has absolutely no support that comes from not just the US government, but the US in general. And Keith Kellogg yesterday basically blamed Ukraine for that situation because of this argument in the Oval Office that basically, let's be frank, was instigated by J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, not by Vladimir Zelensky. He merely tried to defend his position quite politely and diplomatically in that kind of Jerry Springer-esque escapade that took place in the Oval Office. Quite disgraceful to see that amongst supposedly the leader of the free world, Donald Trump. On top of it, Keith Kellogg yesterday, when asked about why this military aid and intel was being shut off, he had the gall to say that it was like striking, I'm paraphrasing a little here, striking a mule in the forehead to shock them with a 4x4. Basically, he made an analogy describing Ukrainians as farm animals that need to be smacked in the face by a 4x4. This is a country that, and a people that have been invaded since 2014 by Russia, an imperialistic, revanchist neighbor, who have been resisting violently against this with a significant degree of US support and other allies supporting them, that are basically fighting for their survival as an independent nation. And he has the temerity to describe them as, basically make an analogy, describe them as farm animals that need to be whacked about by the United States, their erstwhile ally. It is absolutely insane to hear this from US officials who have to then go in and supposedly negotiate with Ukraine, but obviously they're not doing any negotiation. They are providing diktats at this stage. So it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy is the way I feel. And I'm reminded when I looked at a lot of the videos at the beginning of the 2022 invasion, a lot of the pro-Russian narratives were about, well, this is not really the Ukrainians, it's the Americans, they're causing the war, NATO expansion, and, you know, it's basically US proxy war to weaken Russia. And suddenly we have, with this new administration, them adopting the same language. Now, that kind of narrative was very popular in the MAGA circles of US politics in general, or a certain segment of it, and this, but not the segment I would have described Marco Rubio belonging to, which is what makes this clearly some sort of coordinated effort to frame things in this way, that basically to remove agency from Ukraine and try to impose a settlement, a very fast settlement on Ukraine, which will be to Russia's advantage and to Ukraine's detriment. It's clear at this point that the US is not Ukraine's ally. They have voted against a resolution from Ukraine at the UN General Assembly, in which Ukraine called it a war of aggression and that Russia should withdraw. The US voted against that resolution. They've taken down the Ukrainian flags outside any of their, well, some of their diplomatic, I'm not sure if it's every single one, but here in the Baltics, I'm wearing Estonian polo shirt today. Because that I can actually see myself. Those flags are now gone. So they are, as I said, maybe generous can be described as neutral, but they're clearly at this point not true. They are envisioning a settlement in which Russia will win this war. That is, looking at all the evidence, what the current US government wants as a result. Their end result is that Ukraine basically capitulates and surrenders to Russia. The US will then declare peace in our time, waving their white little piece of paper like in 1938 with Neville Chamberlain, and then they will move on to other things, and Russia will obviously continue to consolidate and destroy Ukraine and take back control of it, and then presumably move on to attack other countries. Could be here in the Baltics, could be somewhere else that is close to Russia, and Donald Trump just simply won't care. Let's be frank about it. He'll be demanding the Nobel Peace Prize in the meantime, and when inevitably Russia attacks again, he will just blame probably Hunter Biden's laptop and Joe Biden and all this kind of stuff, because it doesn't matter as far as he's concerned. His desired outcome very clearly to me at this point is to see Ukrainian capitulation, and they're doing everything short of actually aiding the Russian forces at this point. The rhetoric just basically resembles Moscow's, so they are on the same page. The big question you should be asking yourself is, why would this serve the US's strategic interest? That was in the definition of a proxy war. And by the way, proxy wars, that label doesn't necessarily make them good or bad or moral or immoral. It's simply a description of the different dynamics at play. How is it in the US's strategic interest that Russia would effectively win the Russo-Ukrainian war and take back control of Ukraine? Well, one theory that was outlined to me over 20 years ago when I was studying international relations at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. It's called SAIS. At the time, it was the leading school or university for international relations in the world. At least that's what it was ranked at. There was a student who came into one of my classes on the region, and he actually outlined that even back then it was kind of a pre-MAGA, pre-even Tea Party position that US should not be in alliance with Europe, that there shouldn't be any transatlantic partnership. And in fact, because China is the looming threat or rival to US hegemony, we used to put hegemony over 20 years ago for the US, that they should actually ally with Russia instead, give most of Europe to Russia. Who cares who occupies control it? And then together they could combine their forces and be in a competition with China. Now, this doesn't make a lot of sense because, well, the US is a liberal democracy, Russia is anything but, and even 20 years ago that wasn't as clear as today, obviously. It was during Vladimir Putin's first term as president. But even then, there was a big debate whether it was still even a liberal democracy. It was basically already described as an illiberal democracy, about to veer into a liberal dictatorship. Russia is now an illiberal dictatorship. And because European countries in general, like France, Germany, UK, Ukraine, are liberal democracies, they have a lot more in common in terms of shared values. The economics make no sense to be with Russia as the US. Russia has very little that the US wants, and it has huge trade with the European Union and the rest of the continent of Europe. And they already had security architecture in place in terms of NATO and similar training, tactics, coordinated infrastructure to a certain extent. Why would you break all that up, give part of it to Russia, and then be with the Russians, who may at any time decide that they want to flip sides and challenge? They don't have much in common with the United States, and almost every day on Russian TV, if you look at it, they are talking about destroying the Anglo-Saxons or the Americans. So it is absolutely, for me, strategically incoherent that the US wants this. There was a little bit of strategic sense with respect to the Biden approach, which I disagreed with, which was basically to support Ukraine as long as it takes without stating the end goal. It seemed like this current impasse was actually what they were aiming for, never giving Ukraine enough materiel on time or with the right permissions in order for Ukraine to actually win this war and eject the Russian forces from occupied Ukrainian territory, if we send that as the end goal. And because this was also weakening the Russian economy and their army. However, because they never allowed Ukraine to actually finish off Russia, Russia has, of course, adapted. It's still relatively weak. It cannot win this war militarily, even if the US were actually neutral at this point, it would seem, never mind if the US was actually helping Ukraine to achieve that objective. But if Russia, in spite of this train wreck of an invasion, were allowed to win the Russo-Ukrainian war and take back effective control of Ukraine, they then would feel justified in terms of the huge economic and personnel cost and material cost that they've endured. It would give them potentially an out if sanctions were lifted to give their economy, they're pretty close to an economic meltdown, but give them a way softer landing. And it would then allow Vladimir Putin to push towards, even further towards totalitarianism and prepare the Russian people and their military to engage in future wars in the medium to long term. And they would almost certainly learn from their mistakes in the war in Ukraine and use that to their advantage, and then pose a huge threat to the rest of the European continent at a minimum. So this does not seem to be in the US strategic interest unless the US actually really believes, the current administration, that an alliance with Russia is more beneficial to the United States at this juncture in history than an alliance with Europeans. So I'll leave you on that rather pessimistic thought, and Slava Ukraini, do побачення. Oh, and subscribe down below to the channel if you haven't already done so.